somebody asked me if I would talk about life after death, and I offered also to say a prayer for his grandfather, which sounds like a very Christian tradition, so I hope to be able to explain that. For the Christian, the consequences of the victory of Jesus over death for all baptized believers are not just post-mortem consequences. It's not just the consequences of what happens after you die. The transformation of the meaning of our physical death takes place when we believe in the resurrection of Christ from the dead. It's a liberating perspective also for our daily life. It has consequences for Christians in the way they live on a daily basis. The transformation of our perspectives on life. Cardinal Martini, who died a few years ago, he used to be the Archbishop of Milan in the Catholic Church. And he wrote how our perspectives on life are changed when we believe in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. We see our lives as not to be lived as pleasure-seeking as possible, as if to avoid the last moments of death. But when death is given another meaning, not as an end, but as a doorway to a continuing life, then we no longer look upon death as something to be avoided at all costs. And the Christian can live more fully in the present time. So there is a transformation of our perspectives on life. We don't hold to the ethic of living it up as much as possible now because tomorrow we die, but rather in service and in harmony with God's plan for humanity, we no longer need to fear death. So belief in survival after death, this goes back a long way, even into prehistory. Even in very ancient times, there's evidence of arms and food and other items being left in graves going all the way back to the Paleolithic age. It's a human experience, I think. It's difficult for us to believe that death is really the last word. My own father died in 2010. And about 3 months later, it was getting pretty cold, I think it was in January, he died in October. She said something that I think shows how every human being believes in the continuance of life somehow, or at least it's very difficult for us to believe that death is absolutely the last thing. About 3 months after my father's death, we were going by the cemetery to visit his grave, and there was snow over the ground. And my mother turned to me and she said to me, "I hope he's not cold." And it was kind of funny because, of course, we knew that my father couldn't feel anything with his body there in the cemetery. But it's a natural feeling that a wife has for her departed husband. "I hope he's not cold." She couldn't help saying it. I was really surprised at that, but I think it points to that intuition that all human beings have, that death is not the end. A special value in Paleolithic times seems to have been attached to the head. We see the craniums honored in many ancient cultures. And in many traditional societies, too, ancient beliefs continue to be found. There is a belief in actions being effective at a distance, that if a loved one has gone to the place of the spirits, as ancient cultures or traditional cultures may believe, they can still influence life among the living here in the physical world. That's a very ancient belief too, just based on the idea that actions can be taken at a long distance, even though the distance might be between heaven and earth, or the spiritual world and the physical world. And also a belief in the fundamental unity of all the members of the same group, that death does not break that bond with the group. I lived for many years in Chile and found that there were still some beliefs there that go back to before Christian times. And it's very common in Chile to see little monuments or little houses by the side of the road where someone may have died unexpectedly in an accident or hit by a car. Excuse me. And these structures are called Anitas. There's a belief that if someone dies unexpectedly, their spirit stays in one place, until it can be liberated into the spirit world by the prayers and the offerings of those who are still here on earth. So you often see these Anitas with flowers and decorated, and even with food and drink there. People believing that the souls of those who die unexpectedly are someplace in between heaven and earth. And so if you need favors from heaven or the spiritual realm, you can ask this person who is in between, and they will grant favors. And so you pray for them, and eventually they will be released into heaven. And these beliefs, of course, go back to before Christian times in South America. It's very common. An essential part of the individual's identity or consciousness continues to exist after the death of the body in the individual's lifetime. This is a common belief found in many cultures and many traditions. Some belief systems, such as those of the Abrahamic tradition, which would include Muslims, Jews, and Christians, hold that the dead go to a specific plane of existence after death, as determined by a god, gods, or other divine judgment based on their actions or beliefs during life. So we find this very common and especially accentuated, sharpened in the Abrahamic traditions, that the actions we take during life have consequences for us after our physical death. This intuitive openness to the possibility of life's continuance beyond physical death is culturally universal among the peoples of the earth. We often find religious systems and spiritual traditions in all human societies that try to reconnect with the spiritual world. Then the spiritual world is sensed as the source of joy and happiness and peace and liberation for human beings here on earth, who often experience, as we all do, frustration and problems and sadness. So in all societies, they have developed techniques and rituals that seem to help people connect temporarily with the spiritual realm and thus gain a greater sense of joy and peace. So you can see how that is easily extended into the idea that when a human being dies, their spirit has gone to the source of life and peace and joy. There's a related sense of accountability for what we have done in life as well, for the major moral decisions of our lives expressed in the belief in a time for judgment. All the Abrahamic traditions believe that there is a time for judgment after one's physical death. For Christians, we find a clear example of this belief in Jesus' well-known parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25. Jesus is shown in this parable or story as returning at the end of time as the judge of all people, the last judgment. Those who have fed the hungry welcome strangers, those who have clothed the naked, those who have cared for the sick, those who have visited those in prison, they will inherit heaven. But those who have not cared for the poor and unfortunate will be condemned to eternal punishment. In a similar way, many passages in the New Testament state that human beings will be judged according to their works. In the book of Revelation, which is the last book of the Christian Bible, in 20, verse 13, we find the phrase, "And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and all were judged according to what they had done." In a similar way, St. Paul, one of our first great Christians, writes, "For all of us must appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each may receive recompense for what has been done in the body, whether good or evil." And then in his letter to the Romans, Paul also writes, "He will repay according to each one's deeds. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight, but the doers of the law who will be justified." And yet there is at the same time a strong tradition in Christianity that deeds alone are not enough to obtain salvation. Faith is more important. Faith is fundamental. Faith in God and in the saving role of Jesus Christ is also necessary. In dying to our sins, Jesus took upon himself the punishment for sin. If we put our faith in him as Savior, we are reconciled with God through this faith, which is not just verbal confession, it's not just something we say with our lips, but a way of life that is sustained by God's Spirit and expressed in love of God and love of neighbor, effective love, real love, visiting the sick, working for justice. All Christians agree that faith in God and in the saving work of Jesus Christ is necessary for salvation. But there are differences. We differ on how important good works are. Lutherans and Calvinists traditionally have held that Christians are saved by faith alone, while Catholics and others hold that works also count in the final judgment. The two positions have recently been reconciled to a great extent in the 1999 joint declaration of the World Lutheran Federation and the Roman Catholic Church that issued a joint statement on justification by faith. The earliest reference in the Bible to prayers for the dead comes in the Old Testament, in the Jewish scriptures that have been preserved in the Christian Bible, specifically in the second book of Maccabees, which is rather late. We know that the Christian Bible is comprised of the New Testament, which is all about Jesus Christ, and the Old Testament, which was centuries before Jesus Christ. But the books that compose the Old Testament, the 5 books of the Pentateuch, the writings of the prophets, the Psalms, they reveal that they were written in different times and came to be collected together. So the second book of Maccabees, in fact, is one of the latest books of the Old Testament for us, written perhaps only a few hundred years before Jesus was born. And in this second book of the Maccabees, the Maccabees, they recount the struggle of the Jewish people for freedom against the empire of the time, the Seleucid Empire. And they are written from a Jewish point of view, Orthodox Jewish. The second book of Maccabees tells us of how Judas Maccabee, the Jewish leader, led his troops into battle. When the battle ended, he directed that the bodies of those Jews who had died be buried. And as the soldiers prepared their slain comrades for burial, they discovered that each was wearing an amulet, a magic medal, taken as booty or prize in war from a pagan temple. This violated the Jewish law. And so Judas and his soldiers prayed for these dead comrades that God will forgive the sin that these men had committed. That's found in the second book of Maccabees, chapter 12. So this is the first indication in the Bible of a belief that prayers offered by the living can help free the dead from any sin that would separate them from God in the life to come. In this way, I'm explaining the roots of the Catholic belief that praying for the dead is a very pious and good thing to do. It is echoed in the New Testament when St. Paul offers a prayer for a man named Onesiphorus who had died. And Paul writes, "May the Lord grant him to find mercy from the Lord on that day." That's in his first letter to Timothy. The cave-like tombs under the city of Rome, which we call catacombs, bear evidence that members of the Roman Christian community gathered there to pray for their fellow followers of Christ who lay buried there. By the 4th century, prayers for the dead are mentioned in Christian literature as though they were already a long-standing custom. So the practice of praying for the dead is rooted first in the Christian belief in the everlasting life promised in Jesus' teachings and foreshadowed by his disciples' experience that God had indeed raised him from the dead. After death, even though separated from our earthly body, we yet continue a personal existence in the Christian belief. It is as living persons that God invites us into a relationship whose life transcends death. The love of God knows no boundaries, and so we believe that the new life that God has given us in his great love for humanity through Jesus Christ knows no limits either, and is actually actually brings us into God's presence. Praying for the dead has further origins in our belief in the communion of saints. Members of this community who are living often assist each other in faith by prayers and other forms of spiritual support. Christians who have died continue to be members of the communion of saints. We believe that we can assist them by our prayers, and they can assist us by theirs. It's an interesting belief, but you can see the logic. That if someone dies who was really a shining example of Christian service, of a life lived for the poor, and when that person dies, it's very natural for Christians to believe that they go on helping people, that they're just of their nature inclined that way, and they certainly must be in God's presence, we feel. That's why we call them saints and have a canonization ceremony in the Catholic Church to express this belief that certain persons were so good during their lifetimes that by the grace of God, not because of their works, but they will continue to help people even after they die. Praying for the dead. Our prayers for the dead began right at the moment that someone dies. Often family members will gather in prayer around the bedside of the person who has just died. And the order of Christian funerals in the Catholic Church includes a vigil service for the deceased, also called a wake, which can be held in the home, in the church, or in a funeral home chapel. The funeral mass and the rite of committal in the Catholic Church, the rite of committal which generally takes place at the burial site, express these prayers of hope that God will free the person who has died from any burden of sin and prepare a place for that person, him or her, in heaven. Death remains a mystery for us, a great unknown, yet Christian language evokes a hopeful imagination in the presence of death and assurance that our love, linked to Christ's love, can help bridge whatever barriers might keep those whom we love from fully enjoying the presence of a loving and life-giving God. There is also in the Catholic Church, over the centuries, there's developed the idea of purgatory, a purification process after one dies. And this has its roots that go back even before Jesus to the common practice of praying and caring for the dead, and the practice of prayer for the dead with a view to their afterlife purification, which is also found in Judaism, from which Christianity grew. The same practice appears in other traditions, such as the medieval Chinese Buddhist practice of making offerings on behalf of the dead who are said to suffer numerous trials. Among other reasons, Catholic belief in purgatory is based on the practice of prayer for the dead. Purgatory has also been a traditional belief of Catholics that affirms that the entrance into God's presence is a transitional event, that it takes time in some sense, requiring a process of purification and further growth. All who die in God's grace, I'm quoting now from our Catechism of the Catholic Church, all who die in God's grace and friendship, but still imperfectly purified, are indeed assured of their eternal salvation, but after death, they undergo purification so as to achieve the holiness necessary to enter the joy of heaven. This is in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, numbers 1030 to 1031. Specific examples of belief in purification after death and of the communion of the living with the dead through prayer are found in many of the Church Fathers. It goes all the way back to people like Irenaeus in the year 130, Clement of Alexandria in the year 150, even St. Augustine in the 4th century also shared these beliefs of the afterlife and the souls of the martyrs entering into eternal blessedness after going through purgatory. So, to finish up, in that belief already expressed of hope that God will free the person who has died from any burden of sin and prepare a place for that person in heaven, I'd like you to hear me offer a prayer. Now, this could be interesting for you. I offer the following prayer for Sabri's grandfather. O God, searcher of hearts and most loving consoler, who know the faith of those here present, grant that as we mourn the grandfather of Sabri, Husameddin Ertumayr, now departed from this life, we may all be assured that he has been entrusted to your divine compassion. Amen. Thank you all.